A few years ago, my grandfather went missing. I moved into his house immediately, and when he was declared legally gone after a while, I ended up inheriting it. It would lead to a terrible experience, one that I barely survived. For months after his disappearance, I had the same reoccurring dream. My grandfather, Chester Middleton, would be standing in the corner of the fields behind his house, his back turned to me. The night sky, a gray-black and covered in clouds that rushed by, as if they had been previously recorded and now the video was played in fast forward. He had gone missing a few months ago, and there had still been no sign of him or his body being found. "Grandpa," I said, waking up behind him, shivering and barefoot. "You're back." "Not yet, Johnny," he said in his usual slow way. It was strange to have a conversation with someone's back, and I had to lean forward to hear his quiet words. "But soon I will be. You will find me and bring me home." "But how could I find you? It's so dark here," I said, squinting just to make out his silhouette. I moved closer to him. "You'd be surprised at what you can find if you go looking in dark places," he said. "And some of those things will also find you." He turned then, showing half of his face blown off, the teeth and bone below showing off his eternally grinning skull. "Look at how much they've changed me, Johnny. Look." He rubbed both of his gnarled, calloused fingers over his face, a gesture that I had seen him do countless times. A waterfall of red dripped down his body from his half-missing face, but the strange black soil where he stood drank up every drop instantly, leaving no trace at all. I awoke, screaming and covered in sweat. I ripped the covers off and jumped out of bed pacing, looking out the window into the fields behind the house. I expected to see his shadow there just like in the dream, but it was only dark fields extending on for acres. As time went on, this nightmare became a daily burden. I became afraid to go to sleep, and when I did fall into an exhausted slumber, I would always wake up screaming. The dream became longer, and at the end, my grandfather would always point to a trail in the corner of the field, one that never existed as long as I had been living at that house. Sometimes it would start to rain, fire, or the trees along the borders of the field would begin to drip that red all over the ground. White rotted hands often reached out of the trail, grasping at anything and everything yet finding no purchase. I tried taking sleeping pills, opioids, cannabis, heavy doses of alcohol, and whatever else people said would give me a dreamless and peaceful sleep. But none of it worked. I lost weight, dark circles began to appear underneath my eyes, my face becoming more and more gaunt with the passing of the weeks. Even in my waking hours, I still saw my grandfather's face, the skull underneath frozen in the endless smile of the dead. It became so bad that I began to consider things that I would have never thought of before. One of my friends from college had been heavily interested in the occult, eventually joining a secretive group known as the Golden Dawn, who were supposed practitioners of black magic. I called him up on FaceTime one afternoon, nearly hallucinating from sleep deprivation. The light seemed much brighter, and I became tired after doing nearly anything. I went to work in a fugue-like state, and the days all blended together into one never-ending hallucinatory delirium. "Johnny, buddy, how you doing?" my friend Nathan said in a calm, detached demeanor that he nearly always used. "You look a little rough around the edges." Not good," I said, explaining how my grandfather had gone missing, and how my reoccurring nightmare of the secret trail had plagued me for weeks straight. "Is this the house that your grandfather left you? The one where the small private graveyard was built on the border of the property?" I paused, tried to remember if Nathan had ever been here to visit me. My mind moved sluggishly, and memories came slowly to me now. And then I remembered that he had visited me once here during our first year at college. How did you remember that? I asked him, genuinely curious for the first time since beginning this conversation. He laughed. Don't you know who's buried there? Is it kind of famous or more likely infamous? He said. I shook my head. I have no idea what you're talking about, I said. Well, it was long before either you or I were born, back in the early 1900s. A farmer there had killed his whole family one night. They were snowed in, and some people just think that he had gotten cabin fever. Maybe they're right, I don't know. His name was Harris McCune, and he went through the house, slitting the throats of his 2 daughters before moving on to his wife. None of them ever woke up or tried to fight back, at least according to the police. It's like they were all in a stupor or hypnotized, or maybe just drugged or something, I don't know. He ended his killing spree by writing a note in his own blood. It was a full rambling of lunacy, talking about how he needed to protect his family from demons who lived in the fields. But he also said that there was a secret trail back there that led somewhere else. Some dark, horrifying place where the dead don't stay dead, and the dirt of the trail itself drinks blood, forever thirsty for more. I paused, waiting for the punchline. Wait, are you serious right now? I asked. How did nobody ever tell me about what had happened to my house? And how do you know so much about it? I grew up in this town too, he said. I listened and read, and clearly you did not. The history teacher at the high school knew all about it, as well as the members of the historical society. I guess you just never asked the right questions, or really, many questions at all. Is there anything that I can do about it? I asked. There was a long pause. I'll take a couple of others in the Golden Dawn, Nathan said. Maybe this weekend I can stay over and we'll figure out something. The rest of the week passed by slowly, but at least I had hope. I would see Nathan on Friday, and maybe this would all be over. I could finally sleep again without waking up screaming every night. I could finally be at peace in my own house. Things got worse on Thursday night. I had the same reoccurring dream, my grandfather pointing at the mysterious hidden trail, and the trees all weeping red in an eerily lit twilight world. I was standing in the field when, without warning, grasping hands latched onto my body, forcibly pulling my left arm while digging into my skin with fingers that felt as hard as iron. I shrieked in mortal terror, spinning around. There was a man in clothes that would have been in fashion around World War I, his teeth covered in red, small trickles of it running down his chin. His eyes were burning in their intensity, his dilated pupils staring into my face with an insane sheen. How much more must I bleed them? He asked, his voice sounding slurred and slowed. He kept having to stop and spit blood out. They told me if I bled them that I would find peace. How much more, man? I can't do this much longer. I cut their throats while they slept. I did everything they asked of me. So, why? Looking down at where he had grabbed my arm, I saw deep claw marks. I looked back up quickly at the man stepping back. His fingers were in reality white bone, sharpened to dagger-like blades. Harris McCune turned, the back of his head showing, and I saw right into his brains. It looked as if he had put a shotgun or a pistol directly into his mouth and took out the backside of his skull. There was an exit wound the size of an orange, giving me a perfect view of what had once been his brain and skull. Behind him, I saw a middle-aged woman and 2 teenage girls. They all had their throats cut, their dilated pupils staring straight at me as waterfalls of red ran down the front of their bodies. I bled them for the blind god, Harris McCune said. How much more blood does he need? At that point, I woke up in my bed, covered in sweat. A stinging sensation in my arm caused me to look down, where I saw the slash marks from his razor-sharp bone claws on my left arm. Nathan ended up showing with another woman that I had never met before. He said that she was a third-order magus and one of the leading practitioners of both black and white magic in the southeastern United States. None of that meant anything to me, but I was glad that I was no longer alone dealing with this nightmare. Nathan always reminded me of some German super soldier, a topic that I made jokes about with him. He stood over 6 feet tall with blonde hair and blue eyes. He was a clear gym rat at that, with huge arms and a thick chest. In contrast, the woman standing next to him was much shorter and older, though she didn't appear to have a wrinkle on her middle-aged face. Her hair was pure black and her eyes were wide and blue. "This is Nora," Nathan said. I went to shake her hand, but she walked right past me, looking out into the cornfields. "There's something different about this place," she said in an airy voice. I felt the need to roll my eyes, but I remembered that they had volunteered to come out of their way and spend the night simply to help me. And moreover, I remembered what desperate straits I was in. These people may be my only hope. And then she did something that sent chills down my spine. She pointed at the same spot my grandfather always pointed to in my dreams. "The universe is thin here. It is a point where some may cross over or those beings from the astral worlds may enter into ours. I'm not surprised this house has been the scene of so much trouble. The killing of an entire family may not have been the cause of the thinning, but in effect, the dark spirits from the higher dimensions can use the weak minds of those afflicted by insanity, grave physical illness, or lifelong addiction to do their bidding." She stopped, taking a deep breath and closing her eyes. I didn't know if this was a part of some act or not, but I just stood there watching and waiting. After a few moments, she opened them again. "I believe your grandfather somehow ended up in that same place. He's calling out for you, asking for help. Or at least his spirit is. I believe his body is dead." "So, what can I do?" I asked. She looked at me, her large blue eyes as cold as ice. A shiver ran down my back and I turned away from her intense gaze. "You can go and help him, young man. What else are you going to do? Leave him there for all eternity?" With that, she turned her back to me, pulling her purple shawl closer around her neck. I saw a quick glimpse of a tattoo with a white eye built into the center of the pyramid on her wrist. Nathan and Nora went to his car, pulling out various ingredients to begin the ritual that they assured me would open up the trail to us. I saw Nora with an ancient-looking leather-bound tome whose title read, "The Book of Gates." An hour later, we were assembled at the spot where the field had met the forest. A couple 100 feet to the left, the old balcony lay in a clearing in the woods. But where we all looked now was just a cluster of pricker bushes and trees. It looked impenetrable and swampy. Nathan began taking the necessary objects out of the box while Nora still held her spellbook. 13 black candles with human remains mixed into the wax. He said to me, smiling as he spread them out in a circle. He reached back into the box and pulled out a glass vial. "Some dirt from the grave of a murderer." Next, he pulled out a branch. The flowering branch of Dadara. And last of all, he pulled out another glass vial, but this one was red. The blood of a murdered virgin. "How did you get this stuff?" I asked him. He looked at me with a half smile. "Dadara grows wild around here. As for the rest, ask me no questions, brother, and I'll tell you no lies." Nora finally spoke, looking up from her spellbook at the moonlit sky. "The time to perform the ritual is running out," she said. "We must begin immediately. I will not recount here how the ingredients were used, and I do not wish to be responsible for anybody else trying to repeat the ritual. The horrors that ritual unleashed cannot be easily comprehended." As Nora finished speaking the last Latin incantation necessary to open the hidden trail, A feeling of anxiety and terror took over my heart. I wished that I could just run away at the moment and never come back to this cursed house, but it was just the house I knew. My grandfather might be out there, and if so, I needed to help him. One moment, I was looking at the thick wall of bushes, ferns, and swampland. As soon as I blinked my eyes, the trail was there with soil as black as obsidian. I took a step back, falling on my back as I tripped over a candle. It's okay, Nathan said, bending down to give me a hand. The ritual worked perfectly. We've opened the pathway. I looked up, squinting and peering down the black trail. Everything looked strange. The trees were not native to this region. They had dark red bark and thorns ran all up and down their exterior. Their leaves were curved into the shapes of a scythe, and the strangest of all, they exuded a resinous sap that trickled down their bark, a sap that looked like thick and dark blood. Nathan reached into his pack, pulling out 2 pistols. He handed one to me, giving me his crooked half-smile. Just in case, he said simply. I took it, making sure the safety was on. He handed me a simple chest holster as well, which I put on over my shirt. Nathan had an identical one under his jacket already, which he used to holster his pistol. Picking up his bag, he nodded at Nora and me. All right, let's do this, he said excitedly. Nora shook her head. You better tamp down your glee, young man, she said. There are things along that trail that would drive you insane simply by looking at them. There are things that would suck your blood out or dismember you while you're still alive. Remember, we are only going to get his grandfather out of there and then we leave immediately. If he's dead, we will free his spirit. If he's alive, then we'll grab him and guide him out. Understood? Nathan nodded, apologizing sheepishly. Keep an eye out also for what we seek. The bark of Zekum, the blood of the Ancient One, and the soil from the Endless Stairs. I found this curious, but I didn't ask about it at the time. We started walking. The moment that we passed through the threshold of the trail, I could feel it. There was a buzzing noise like being directly underneath high-voltage power lines, and a smell like ozone had filled the air. It wasn't unpleasant, but it seemed to indicate that whatever this place was, it was full of energy. As we walked further away from the threshold, I looked back, expecting to see the field and house in the distance. But to my surprise, there was only an endless, winding black trail behind me, leading into a group of desolate, rocky canyons that I had never seen before. Apparently, we were stuck here. Up ahead, I heard a chattering of teeth and a low moaning noise. We came across a sharp turn to the right, and a massive tree stood there, hundreds of feet tall. It had no leaves or fruits. Instead, demonic heads hung from the branches, swaying softly in the wind. Their faces were flat and deflated looking, their eyes pure black or glowing red. They opened and closed their mouths slowly in time with the breeze, creating the constant chittering noise. It was as if they were freezing to death, even though the air was warm and humid. Nora put out a hand, stopping us abruptly in front of the tree. Beyond, I saw the black trail split into 7, some ascending and others descending. There were no signs or indications of which trail was the right one. The tree of Zekum, Nora said softly, looking at the strange fruit that the tree produced. As she said its name, the eyes of the demon heads all turned to look at her. Their expressions ranged from fury to disinterest to obvious pain. Their sunken, emaciated faces then examined me and Nathan. Do you know the way? Nathan asked her. She shrugged, apparently unafraid of the horrific sight in front of us. They know the way, she said, pointing to the heads. We only need to ask them. I had my doubts about this, but said nothing. She stepped forward. Those who are one with the holy tree of Zekum, she said, we ask for your help. We are travelers lost on the trail. We look for one who has come here before us, an old man who came from the fields nearly 4 months ago. His name," she turned to me. "His name is Chester Middleton," I said loudly and confidently, stepping forward. "He's my grandfather. He has gone missing from my world. Have you seen him?" At first, nothing happened, though the chattering of teeth stopped. Hundreds of pairs of eyes focused on me in the utter silence. Not a bird sang or an insect hummed in the stillness. All at once, the mouths of every decapitated head opened, and a voice emerged from all of them simultaneously. It was deep and gurgling. "We have seen the one you seek," they said in unison. "Give us a sacrifice of blood and we will tell you the way." I looked at Nora, one eyebrow raised. She nodded at me, holding out a dagger. "They want some of your blood to feed the tree," she said. I gaped at her. "Just a little, just cut your arm or hand or whatever you feel like and leave a few drops of blood on the roots of the tree. They won't help us without a sacrifice from you, no matter how small that may seem. After all, you are the reason that we're here." I took her ceremonial dagger, gazing down at the rubies and opals that adorn the handle, the curved blade with strange hieroglyphs marking its steel surface. I did as she said. Walking up to the tree standing directly next to it, I realized just how huge it really was. I had seen the redwoods in California, and this was taller than any of those. Its black bark looked ancient, with deep gouges and cracks running up and down as far as the eye could see. I put my left arm out where the trunk disappeared into the soil, putting a small slash into the top of my skin. A small trickle of blood ran down my skin, dropping into the soil below. As soon as it touched the dark ground, the earth sucked it in. The trees seemed to sigh with pleasure, the heads all smiling at once in unison, their eyes all looking down at me. "Your grandfather is on the 7th path," they said. 7, the holy number, the number of strength and mysticism. Take no other path unless it is death that you seek, and you may find it regardless. And then they went silent, closing their mouths. A strong breeze blew down the path and they began to chatter again, returning to their previous expressions of mixed pleasure, pain, fury, and sadness. Nora stepped forward, taking the dagger back. She peeled a small piece of the black bark off of the tree, wrapping it in a silken cloth and placing it in her bag. I wiped the blood away on my shirt, returning to my group. We looked at the 7 trails. I wondered what the first 6 held. Without hesitation, though, we took the last one, walking forward to find my grandfather, or whatever was left of him in this cursed place. As we walked forward on the trail, we saw a flickering light up ahead, illuminating the blood-red trees in a fiery glow. "What is that?" I asked Nathan and Nora. They walked in front of me side by side, quiet silhouettes in the dark night. A creeping sense of dread rolled through me. "Whatever it is, it belongs to the trail," Nathan said. "This trail is older than human civilization, older than humanity itself, most likely. The ancient ones have long lived in the space between universes, hiding in plain sight, coming out when they need to feed. They used to feed on the pain and suffering of animals, but ever since humans began to spread, they've grown accustomed to more sophisticated tastes, let's say. Many of the ancient stories are based on true places," Nora continued. "The river Styx and the ferryman Charon, for example, were based on visions of the mystics from ancient times. The souls of the dead wander in places like this, eternally trying to cross over to the other side. Their loneliness and despair feeds the beings in this plane of existence. But we have protection against them, right?" I said. "They just kept walking, right?" "Well, some," Nathan admitted. "But some of them might drive you mad just by looking at them. There is no such thing as guaranteed. Absolute protection in a place like this. I just hope the trees sent us on the right path, because the wrong path would lead to something far worse than just lost souls. The light grew brighter as we approached it. Soon I could see a massive fire on the left side of the trail, blue and orange flames flickering off of it and illuminating everything around for hundreds of feet. In front of it stood a child. She looked only 5 or 6 years old. She had a little blue dress on with dirty blonde hair and blue eyes. As I got closer, I saw that she had an ear-to-ear grin on her face. "Go slow," Nathan whispered back to me. Nora looked totally unfazed. She just stared down a few feet in front of her as if nothing was disturbing about this in any way. The child's head began to turn to the right, and then it kept turning. It spun backwards on her head, the skin on her neck stretching as the bones cracked and the tendon snapped, then finished turning in a complete circle. Blood was pouring from her eyes now, and her teeth had lengthened into points. "Do you come to join the circle?" she asked in a low and childish voice. "We have many before you who have come and they still stay here." She pointed behind her to the fire, which suddenly went out. I saw blackened, smoking corpses lying on the ground there, still moving their arms and trying to turn their heads, their mouths opened in silent screams. "We do not come for you," Nora said, looking up and making eye contact with the demonic girl. "And how do you know that we then do not come for you in return?" she asked, her face staying forwards now, the skin still stretched around her neck in a disturbing and twisted manner. "We do not appreciate visitors here. This is no place for the living." Her limbs seemed to lengthen, her broken neck stretching out as her eyes darkened to pure black. Fangs began to emerge from her mouth. The corpses behind her twitched and moaned, trying to scream, but their melted and damaged faces just made small gasping noises. The girl laughed as she transformed into a creature straight out of my worst nightmares. All of her limbs were twisted, broken and oozing dark blood now. She began to walk towards us on legs with the bones poked out through the skin. Each step made a crunching and grinding sound as the broken bones rubbed together. Nora began to chant, her eyes rolling back in her head. The language was low and growling and hissing. It was like nothing that I had ever heard before. She reached in her pocket, grabbing a leather pouch and sending a shower of silver dust forward. The demonic girl screamed as it touched her. She began to revert from a mutated nightmarish creature back to the facade of a sweet little girl that she had taken when we first walked up here. Without hesitation, Nathan pulled out his gun and fired at her, hitting her in the stomach. The bullet went right through her small body, sending out a spray of flesh and bone from her back. The girl shrieked at him, her mouth disengaging and opening wide. Her cries were so loud that they made my ears ring. They seemed overlapping and continuous. And then she turned and ran, leaving behind drops of black blood as she fled the scene. Without hesitation, Nora pulled a small glass vial from the inside of her satchel. After a minute, she had succeeded in capturing some of the blood from the injured creature. It looked like oil in the glass, shimmering and sending off iridescent colors as it splashed back and forth across the vial's bottom surface. "The blood of an ancient one," she said to herself, so quietly that I almost didn't hear her at all. I was badly shaken up. My hands trembled. The gun that Nathan had given me was out, but I didn't really have confidence that it could kill everything here. A little girl shot with this caliber should have been on the ground bleeding out, but she had just been injured and was still able to run. As we walked past the moaning, burnt bodies in the ground, Nathan bent over and put a bullet into the foreheads of each of them in turn. They stopped moving. I was glad. The girl had called these tortured souls her circle. How many more were there in this place just like them? I had wondered. I didn't have long to think about it though. The scenery was changing all around me. The dark red bleeding trees had begun to thin out, and behind them, I saw endless fields stretching to the horizon in every direction. They weren't growing food, however. Crucifixes had been nailed into the ground in straight rows. Every single one had a body on it. There were thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. It was impossible to tell. The lines made a sight almost like an optical illusion as the cross symbol was repeated over and over, until they blurred together in the distance and disappeared. Men, women, and children bled from their hands and feet where they had been crucified, dripping fresh red into the earth below. Ropes had been tied around their arms and legs to add more strength to the bindings, and likely to keep the nails from just ripping right through their palms. They continuously tried to push themselves up from the slanted wooden block their feet were nailed to, taking in a breath as quickly as they could before slumping back down. This process repeated over and over. The endless suffocation, the pushing up, the collapse back down, until eventually, the victims were too tired from exhaustion. At this point, their heads would loll and their eyelids would begin to shut, the lips turning blue as they suffocated on the cross. As I watched, I realized that many had already passed, and more were joining them every minute. Others looked fresher, and some even screamed out to us, begging for help, pleading for us to let them down and save them from this horrible fate. I looked over at Nathan, who was walking directly beside me. "Just ignore them," he said gruffly. "They're not really alive, you know. You couldn't even help them if you tried." "They belong here," Nora said. "They feed the trail. The earth itself feeds on their blood and suffering here. Remember that you are only here for one." I nodded, refocusing myself. I had to find my grandfather. The moans and screams followed us for miles. The field seemed to never end. The dark soil of the trail just twisted through them, serpentine and winding, until finally I saw a break up ahead. The trees had started up again, and in the middle of the path, I saw a circular rung of black metal. "Ah, good," Nora said. "I thought we would never get here." Closing in, I saw the black metal was actually the railing for a staircase. The trail ended as suddenly as it had begun. A cluster of ferns and thorns grew wild beyond it, and the darkness of the forest was nearly impenetrable. I saw white eyes reflecting light back at me as I peered deeper inside. The eyes would have been bodies at least as tall as me, but no human eye ever reflected such a silver glow in the dark. "The endless stairs," Nathan said, peering down. He wasn't exaggerating. As I looked at the circular railing spiraling down and down, they really did seem endless. Nora knelt beside the stairs, taking a knife and working off some of the grayish-blue soil that started on the top rung and clung to every stair as far as the eye could see. She grabbed a vial and gently poured some of the strange substance into it, sealing it tightly and putting it into her satchel. I grabbed a huge rock from the nearby woods. Out of curiosity, I dropped it down the opening in the center of the circular staircase. It took off, falling faster and faster. Following its progress down so many stories gave me a sense of vertigo and nausea. I had to look away. I listened for a loud clanking noise or any indication that I had hit the bottom, but none came. After about 30 seconds, we all looked at each other. "Let's do this quickly," she said. "We have nearly everything that we need now." Nathan nodded. I wondered what exactly these two were plotting. "What do you plan to do with all the stuff that you're collecting here?" I asked. She shrugged. "They're just rare and expensive ingredients. In my line of work, only a fool would waste such an opportunity." She averted her eyes as she spoke, and I got the feeling that she was lying. "Let's go," Nathan said, pressing the button to release his magazine and refilling it with bullets. This is by far the most dangerous part of the journey. Keep your wits about you and your gun out. We went down the stairs, each of us holding tightly to the railing. The clanging of shoes against metal was the only sound, besides the slight breeze that blew through, even down here under the earth. After what seemed like 20 minutes of descending, I saw an aberration in the staircase. A door was built into the wall with a strange symbol etched into the wood. It looked like a backwards 7 with a slash through it. The three of us stood in front of it, examining it. I pressed my hand against the door and realized that it wasn't made of wood. Using my flashlight, I examined it closely. The door was warm and pulsating. It appeared to be wrapped in human skin. Better open it, Nathan said to me. I looked up at him and then wrapped my hand around the knob. It was warm and pulsating just like the rest of the door. Without a second thought, I turned it and flung it open. We all peered inside. At first, it just looked like a curtain of blackness. I shone the flashlight, but it did no good. I walked through. It felt like thousands of small fingers were running along my skin as I entered. The sensation gave me chills. They were cold, hungry, grasping fingers, and they weren't used to the warmth and the light of the living. But after a few steps, the darkness broke, and I saw that I was standing in a long hallway. The floors, walls, and ceilings were all made of dark stone. Looking back, I saw Nathan and Nora emerge from the cloud of blackness. They nodded at me, looking pale and uncertain. "This is the first circle," Nora said. "We should find your grandfather somewhere around here." A room emerged on the left as we walked further in. I looked in, seeing the horrific scene from my nightmares. Harris McCune stood there, surrounded by the still living bodies of his family. His wife and daughters were choking on their blood and their lips were turning blue as they laid in bed. They tried to claw their way forward, ripping at the sheets and mattress, dyeing everything red. Harris turned to look at us, smiling. The back of his head was missing, but his face was intact. "Finally, it is almost over," he said. "You fools, you idiots. You woke him up. You woke up the blind god and now he's coming. He's coming, Nathan didn't hesitate. He raised the pistol and started firing at Harris. Holes opened up all down Harris's chest and he stopped talking, looking down in surprise. A look of happiness crossed his face as he fell back, his eyes fluttering then closing as an expression of peace came over his unmoving body. I had lost sight of his wife and daughters in the shootout. Looking down, I saw a little girl that crawled right up to me, her throat leaving a blood-red trail from the bed to my feet. Without hesitation, she reached a bony-clawed hand up and raked it down my leg. It shredded my pants and I felt the punctures go all the way into my muscle. "She got me," I screamed, and started shooting blindly down at the ground. Blood poured down my leg. I stumbled back to the entrance, dragging my bad leg behind me as I went. The three of us got out of there and slammed the door shut. "Wrong room," Nathan said, sweating heavily. He started laughing. I sat down and we wrapped a piece of cloth around my leg, tightening it to help stop the bleeding. Luckily, it hadn't punctured any major vessels and I could still walk, but it hurt like crazy. There was another room on the left. We opened it and it revealed what looked like a medieval castle's main chamber. Corpses had been skinned alive, their intestines out of their body and spiraling away from them, looking like snakes in the light glow of the castle's torchlight. And then, with mounting horror, I realized that they weren't corpses at all. The one closest to me had raised its head, its face totally missing, its eyes ripped out. I could see every muscle of its head as it tried to speak. "The blind god is coming," it said. "The blind god did this. The blind god is coming and you're next." It started coughing, trying to use its body to approach the door. The rest of the people did the same, trying to push themselves up on legs without skin, pulling themselves over small pebbles in the floor that got stuck to them and started new small cuts all over their front. They started to reach their arms out towards us, pleading. Some had their tongues cut out, and they could only make indiscernible vowel sounds. Most of them wept, at least those who still had eyes. I felt transfixed. I stared at this mass of wretched humanity. Every single one of them was still somehow alive. The floor of the castle was covered in so much clotted, thick blood that a slight ripping sound occurred every time one of the people lifted an arm or leg up while crawling forward along the tacky stone. Nathan pulled me back, slamming the door shut. Don't look in there," he said. "There are endless rooms like that one. It'll serve you no purpose to go looking in there." "But what if my grandfather is like one of them? What if he was in there?" I felt feverish and panicked. Nathan shook his head. "I doubt it," he said. He wouldn't elaborate. We kept walking forward down the hall. We found another room further down on the right. I opened it and to my amazement saw my grandfather's fields. He stood in the middle totally intact with his back to us. It reminded me of my dream. "Grandpa!" I yelled at him. He turned around and his face was half torn off. "Oh my God, Johnny," he said, running up to me. The half of his face that was still intact formed a calm smile. I hugged him tight. "How did you find me?" "Don't you worry about that. Are you okay?" I asked. I immediately regretted asking it. What a stupid question, I thought to myself. My grandfather shook his head. "I'm sorry, son, but I'm dead," he said. "I was attacked in the fields and dragged here. I died on the way. Something tore half my face off. I didn't see what it was, but I remember dying. It was cold. And then I woke up here in these fields. But Johnny, I have to tell you, I'm not alone here." A chill ran down my spine at this. "What do you mean, not alone?" "There's something coming," he said, looking back and pointing. I followed his finger. In the distance, I saw a tiny silhouette. I squinted, trying to make it out. It floated above the ground, moving at a superhuman speed, coming closer to the door. Whatever it was, its eyes had been torn out, leaving only black sockets. It was naked, torn up and shrieking. It looked at least 10 feet tall and its shiny black skin clung to its frame tightly. The noise that it made was so piercing that I tried to cover my ears as it got closer and closer, but it didn't help in the slightest. I could no longer hear what my grandfather said, but I saw him mouthing the same word over and over. The blind god. We pulled my grandfather forward through the door and slammed it shut. I heard that shrieking, nearing faster and faster. I looked between Nathan and Nora. Nora was slowly taking ingredients out of her pack, as if there was no rush in the world. "Ah, yes," she said, turning to Nathan quickly. "This is the perfect spot for the ritual. I can feel the energy flowing through this hallway. Dozens of worlds colliding down here in the first circle. What a beautiful sight. What an absolutely powerful feeling." Nathan nodded, sweating heavily. His eyes darted back and forth down the hallway. And then we all heard the blind god on the other side of the door, very close now. His full attention turned to that, but Nora kept talking. "I forgot to tell you, Nathan. Before I can transcend, I need one more ingredient. The blood of a betrayed friend." Smiling sweetly, she pulled out a knife and shoved it into Nathan's stomach as she spoke. He fell with a cry and she kicked his gun away. Slowly, methodically, she traced her fingers in the blood that poured out of him onto the stone floor, licking it off with a moan of pleasure. I love it when it's still warm." She knelt down, putting the fronts and backs of her hands in the puddle of blood until they were totally covered. looking like wet crimson gloves pulled tight over her normal skin. As Nathan crawled away, puddles of blood leaking out of him far too fast, she started the ritual. I started to raise the gun to shoot her, maybe in the leg or in the arm, to stop her from whatever madness she was preparing to unleash. But with a swish of her hand and a cry, I felt the gun ripped away from me and flung down the hallway. She was distracted, however, having already begun the ritual. My gun was far away now, but Nathan's was closer. Using the few seconds of distraction or focus on the ritual had allowed me, I sprinted over to it, grabbing it off the floor. As I ran towards it, I kept track of Nora out of the corner of my eye. She poured the demon child's blood from the vial in her mouth and then, holding the blood under her tongue, blew the dust from the endless staircase in front of her. Holding out the piece of the tree of Zachem in front of her, she walked into the cloud of dust. The cloud seemed to sit there frozen in time, the particles reflecting the sunlight and shimmering, and yet neither moving in the breeze or descending towards the ground. Nora began to scream in pain as she reached the center of the cloud. Her eyes started to melt, dribbling down her cheeks. The skin and muscle holding her jaw in place did likewise, and the jaw fell down lower and lower, held on by increasingly thin tendons and pieces of flesh. The tree root had started to grow, sending out leafy shoots and thick dark roots in all directions of her body. Her milky white skin was soon totally covered in an impenetrable bark. She fell on her knees, vomiting up huge quantities of it. Soon it looked like pieces of her stomach and intestines were coming up as well. Her body was changing, morphing, growing before my very eyes. Her spine was stretching, the bones breaking and reforming. Pieces of bone shot out through her fingers and feet, very long and sharp. Soon all of her clothes had ripped away. She was crouched on the floor in a fetal position, sweating blood from the bark-like texture of her skin, as bony spines started to shoot out of her back. This clawed, a demonic figure looking nothing like the woman that I had come in here with. At that moment, the door was smashed into pieces, and the huge creature my grandfather had referred to as the blind god came into the hallway. Bent double, it barely fit through the shattered door. It looked like a poisonous snake had merged with a blind giant. Shreds of black robe still clung to its body in a few places, and giant reptilian claws jutted out of its hands and feet. With a shriek, it ran at the transformed Nora, biting at her and raking its claws across her back, puncturing the bark-like skin and sending rivers of red flowing out of her. She fought back with equal ferocity, biting with razor-sharp fangs and using her sharpened bony spikes to rip at every exposed area of flesh on the creature's body. "Run," I said, grabbing my grandfather's shoulder and hauling him away. Nathan stumbled and fell, sending droplets of red scattering all over the earthen walls. He tried to follow, but he was slow, wavering, grabbing at his side as he coughed up frothy, bloody spit. We ran back up the staircase, past all the tortured souls who still screamed out for us. I saw another little girl blocking the trail. Stopping cold in my tracks, I pointed the gun at her. Without warning, I started firing, using up the entire magazine. Her head and chest had split open. Black, oily blood dripped out of her as she fell slowly backwards, a demonic grin still plastered across her face. I grabbed my grandfather and got us out of there. Even as I looked back, I saw some of her skin starting to stitch itself back together, though she still hadn't risen. But we had almost made it home. I could see the field of my grandfather's house in the distance at the end of the trail, a tiny pinpoint on the horizon that came closer and closer to us with every passing moment. My grandfather took my hand as we ran towards the entrance of the trail, squeezing it reassuringly. I was seeing spots from running so long. My chest had stitches all up and down it, but it wasn't slowing down until I was safe and away from this insane place. "You did the right thing, son," he said through gasps, tears running down the part of his face, blood streaming down the rest. I never deserved a grandson as good as you. And then we hit the invisible wall dividing my grandfather's property from this trail. As we ran through it, I felt his grip slacken and then release. Looking over, I saw his body rapidly fade, dissolving and blowing away in the wind. I had freed him from that cursed place. I looked back and to my total surprise saw Nathan still alive. He was a little off in the distance at least a quarter of a mile, limping slowly, his clothes covered in blood. He came through the barrier, collapsing in my arms, hyperventilating and in clear pain. "Please," he said, "help me, it hurts so bad." I laid him down in the soft dirt of the field and called an ambulance. I lit a cigarette as I waited, thinking about all the unbelievable things that had happened, wondering if Nora was still alive, or if she were right now being tortured by that insane and blind monstrosity that we had encountered. But as I listened to Nathan's ragged breathing and moans of pain, I knew one thing for certain. I used to be afraid of my nightmares, waking up every night in a sweat, screaming at the darkness. But I'm not afraid of them anymore. Now I know waking life is so much worse.